The blue and red strobes of a Ford Crown Victoria don't just illuminate the cracked asphalt of West Pico Boulevard. They serve as a strobe light for a theater of the absurd. At 3:14 a.m., the air in south-central Los Angeles is a thick soup of salt air from the Pacific and the lingering scent of burnt rubber. A flashbang detonates inside a stucco apartment complex, a sound like the world cracking in half. This is the heartbeat of the American shadow state. Here, the line between the hunter and the hunted isn't just thin. It has been erased, redrawn, and commercialized. We are witnessing the mechanics of a machine that feeds on the very chaos it claims to cure. This is not a war of good versus evil. It is a war of competing franchises, where the badge and the rag are often cut from the same cloth. In the late 1990s, the Los Angeles Police Department's Rampart Division birthed a ghost. They called it Crash Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums. The mandate was simple: break the spine of the Bloods and the Crips by any means necessary. But the vacuum of the street is a powerful thing, and the officers sent to fill it found that the most effective way to control a gang was to become one. This was the Mirror Syndicate. Officers like Rafael Perez didn't just patrol the precincts. They occupied them like territory. They adopted the aesthetics of the enemy. They developed secret tattoos, a skull with an ace of spades and a deep-seated contempt for the judicial process. They held initiation rites that involved the extrajudicial beating of suspects. To the residents of the Pico Union District, the black and white cruiser wasn't a symbol of rescue. It was the arrival of the most heavily armed set in the city. The mechanics of this corruption were clinical. When crash officers moved on a Blood Avenue Piru hangout, it wasn't always to make an arrest. Sometimes it was to tax the inventory. Narcotics seized in the afternoon would be back on the corner by midnight, sold by associates of the officers. The evidence locker became a wholesale warehouse. The state's moral monopoly on violence collapsed under the weight of the Rampart paradox. If the law plants a Saturday night special on a man to ensure a conviction, the law has admitted that its own rules are insufficient. The moment Rafael Perez began orchestrating hits and managing drug corridors under the cover of his badge, the badge became nothing more than a high-tier gang color. For the families living in the shadow of the Harbor Freeway, the distinction between a drive-by and a tactical entry became a matter of semantics. Consider the kitchen of Maria Elena, a grandmother who lived 3 doors down from a suspected trap house. She describes the sound of the Rampart era as a constant low-frequency hum of dread. She didn't fear the local bangers as much as she feared the men with the silver stars who would kick in her door, looking for a nephew she hadn't seen in months, only to leave her living room trashed and her dignity stripped. When the protectors of the block adopt the tactics of the predators, the social contract isn't just broken, it's incinerated. The community learns a lethal lesson. Authority is just another word for the biggest bully. This erosion of trust is a permanent scar, a generational haunting that ensures no witness will ever step forward, and no mother will ever call the police for help. The state didn't dismantle the gang, it perfected the model. While the Rampart Scandal proved that the law could mimic the street, the federal government was busy turning the street into a mathematical equation. Enter the RICO Act. Originally a scalpel designed to excise the godfathers of the Italian mob, it has been repurposed into a dragnet for the digital age. In the modern American ghetto, the conspiracy is the state's most versatile weapon. Prosecutors no longer need to prove you pulled a trigger. They only need to prove you exist within a specific social architecture. If you are seen in the background of a music video on YouTube, if you like a post by a targeted member of the Gangster Disciples, or if you are photographed at a funeral for a fallen friend, the math of RICO begins to aggregate against you. The architecture of a modern RICO indictment is a military-style operation. It begins with the map. Federal agents spend years charting the social DNA of a zip code. They use social media scraping tools to link an 18-year-old Lil Homie in Brooklyn to a regional leader he has never spoken to. The crime isn't the act. The crime is the association. On the night of the takedown, the state executes a mass displacement. 50, 60, sometimes 100 men are removed from a 3-block radius in a single sweep. The intention is to decapitate the leadership, but the reality is more volatile. By removing the management layer, the OGS who, for all their faults, maintain a modicum of order and business logic, the state creates a power vacuum. What follows is the crash dummy phenomenon. When the leadership is swept away by a RICO dragnet, the vacuum is filled by the youngest, most desperate, and most volatile elements of the set. These are teenagers with everything to prove and no one to answer to. The violence becomes disorganized, erratic, and far more lethal for the non-players caught in the crossfire. The state hasn't solved the violence. It has simply lowered the average age of the perpetrator. It is a resetting of the clock. The RICO Act treats the block like a corporate entity to be liquidated, ignoring the fact that the human capital being removed is often the only thing standing between a neighborhood and total anarchy. To the federal prosecutor, a 90% conviction rate is a victory. To the shop owner on 63rd and Halsted, it's the start of a new, more terrifying season of unpredictability. This leads to the most intimate theater of the war, the informant economy. The no-snitching code is the bedrock of the street, but the FBI knows that everyone has a price, and that price is usually measured in years. The state has turned betrayal into a liquid commodity. In the clinical silence of a proffer session, the myth of the brotherhood is systematically dismantled. An OG from the Black P. Stones sits in a room with fluorescent lights that hum at a sickening frequency. He is faced with a choice: die in a concrete box or trade the names of the men he calls brothers for a decade off his life sentence. The state doesn't just use informants, it weaponizes the idea of them. Paranoia is more effective than any wiretap. By intentionally leaking discovery documents or allowing rumors of cooperation to circulate, the state triggers internal gang purges. The paperwork culture, the forensic hunt for court transcripts that prove a member is a rat, is a form of psychological warfare. When a member of the Crips is found dead in an alley with a copy of a witness statement pinned to his chest, the state hasn't just removed a player. It has forced the gang to do the state's dirty work. The code is revealed as a hollow promise. The street doesn't end in a cinematic shootout. It ends in a sterile room where loyalty is traded for a chance to see the sun before you're 70. For those who aren't caught in the RICO dragnet or broken in a proffer session, there is the digital scarlet letter. You don't have to commit a crime to be branded by the state in the 21st century. In cities like Chicago, the gang database is an invisible prison. Using a point system, the police categorize youth based on proximity, attire, and social media activity. Wear the wrong hat in a specific park and you earn 2 points. Stand next to your cousin who is on parole and you earn 5. Once you cross a threshold, you are entered into a database that follows you like a ghost. This is the technology of the panopticon. ShotSpotter sensors on every street lamp, predictive policing algorithms that flag high-risk individuals before they ever touch a weapon, and territorial injunctions that make it a jailable offense for 2 suspected members of the Hoover criminals to stand on a sidewalk together. For a young man in the database, the block is no longer a home. It is a sensor-laden trap. The database creates a permanent underclass. Employers run background checks and see the gang associate tag. Landlords refuse to rent. The state creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. By labeling a child a gang member, they ensure the legal world will never accept them, effectively forcing them back into the arms of the set for survival. The system isn't designed to rehabilitate. It's designed to tag and release until the inevitable takedown occurs. The final stage of this attrition isn't found in a jail cell, but in the zoning office. This is the war of geography. The state has realized that the most effective way to fight a gang is to make the block uninhabitable for its residents. Through civil injunctions, the government targets entire neighborhoods with nuisance abatements. They shut down the corner store that has been the neighborhood's heartbeat for 40 years because it's a suspected front. They use mass evictions as a form of counterinsurgency to break the territorial grip of the Grape Street What's Crips. This salami-slicing tactic is a war on the mundane. Walking to the store, sitting on your own porch, or gathering for a barbecue becomes a criminal act for anyone on the list. The goal is clear. Clear the human assets of the gang to make room for the capital assets of the developer. Law and order in the American ghetto is often the advance guard for gentrification. When the block is finally safe, The people who lived there, the families, the shop owners, the non-players, are long gone, replaced by high-rise condos and artisanal coffee shops. The state wins the war not by solving the social issues, but by deleting the geography where those issues exist. The machine cannot be stopped because the machine is profitable. It provides careers for prosecutors, budgets for police departments, and prime real estate for developers. It is a cycle of managed chaos. The Bloods, the Crips, and the state are locked in a symbiotic dance, each needing the other to justify their existence. The block is the stage, the residents are the collateral, and the ending is always the same. Loyalty is a myth, the badge is a rag, and the only thing that remains is the cold, hard logic of the system. If this investigation into the hidden mechanics of the street has changed the way you see the concrete landscape, consider engaging with more of our deep dives into the architecture of the modern world. The logic of the informant economy is most visible in the sterile, windowless rooms of the federal building, where the air is filtered and the stakes are life and death. Imagine a man named Marcus. To the street, he is an untouchable, a high-ranking member of the Black P. Stones with a reputation for silence. But the state has spent 3 years building a file on Marcus that is 4 inches thick. They have his phone records, his bank statements, and 3 hours of grainy surveillance footage of him meeting with a supplier. The lead investigator doesn't yell. He doesn't have to. He simply lays out 3 folders on the table. One for Marcus's wife, who unknowingly signed for a package of narcotics. One for his younger brother, who is facing a mandatory minimum of 20 years. And one for Marcus, which contains a life without parole sentencing guideline. The state is not just a prosecutor. It is a negotiator in the business of human souls. This is where the proffer session becomes a masterclass in psychological demolition. The investigator offers a deal that is framed as an act of mercy. By cooperating, Marcus can save his family and potentially see his children graduate from high school. The cost of this mercy is the names of 5 other men who trusted him. In this moment, the brotherhood of the gang is revealed as a fragile construction. The state has commodified betrayal, creating a market where the only way to buy your freedom is to sell someone else's. When Marcus finally picks up the pen, he isn't just signing a legal document. He is liquidating the social capital of the block. The state wins because it has turned the gang's primary virtue, loyalty, into its greatest liability. On the street, the fallout of this negotiation is felt in the paperwork. In the digital age, transparency has been weaponized. When a high-ranking member is released early or has charges mysteriously dropped, the neighborhood doesn't celebrate. It begins a forensic investigation. The paperwork, the official court transcripts and discovery documents, is hunted with the fervor of a religious text. If a man's name appears next to a statements made checkmark, he is effectively dead. The state knows this. Sometimes, the FBI will intentionally leave a gap in a file or fail to redact a name just enough to sow the seeds of doubt. They are using the street's own code of honor to trigger internal purges. The rat is hunted by his own, saving the state the cost of a trial and the risk of a shootout. It is a clinical, self-sustaining cycle of destruction. This cycle is amplified by the digital scarlet letter, a system that marks the youth of the block before they ever have the chance to betray or be betrayed. In cities like Chicago and Los Angeles, the gang database is the invisible architecture of the police state. It is a predictive engine that treats the neighborhood like a laboratory. A 17-year-old named Jamal walks to the corner store. He is wearing a blue hoodie, not because he is a Crip, but because it was the only clean laundry he had. He stops to talk to a childhood friend who is on the list. A patrol car rolls by. A camera captures the interaction, and Jamal is pointed. Under the Chicago Police Department's point system, Jamal has just earned enough metadata to be classified as a G associate. He doesn't know it yet, but his life has just been bifurcated. The mechanics of this database are a form of social engineering. Once Jamal is in the system, he is subject to territorial injunctions. These are civil court orders that strip away his basic constitutional rights within a specific geographic zone. If Jamal is seen standing on a sidewalk with another known associate, he can be arrested, not for committing a crime, but for the act of standing. The sidewalk, once a communal space for the neighborhood, is transformed into a high-tech panopticon. The state uses shot spotter sensors to triangulate sound and stingray devices to intercept cell phone signals, turning the block into a digital cage. For Jamal, the world shrinks. He can't go to the park, he can't stand on the corner, and he can't even visit his grandmother without risking a status violation. The collateral damage of this surveillance falls on the non-players, the mothers, the small business owners, and the children who are just trying to survive the geography of their birth. Consider the story of Mrs. Gable, who has owned a small bakery on the edge of Blood territory for 30 years. To the state, her bakery is a nuisance. Because young men occasionally congregate on the sidewalk outside her shop, the city files a civil abatement. They claim her business is a magnet for criminal activity. Mrs. Gable is hit with fines she cannot pay and requirements for expensive security upgrades that her insurance won't cover. The state's goal isn't to stop the crime. It is to remove the anchor. When the bakery closes, the last bit of legitimate communal light on the block goes out. The vacuum is immediately filled by the crash dummies, the young, volatile members who thrive in the darkness. This leads us to the final, most sophisticated mechanic of the state's war, the logic of gentrification. We have been taught to see law and order as a social good, but in the American ghetto, it is often a precursor to a real estate transaction. By using RICO to sweep the leaders, the gang database to mark the youth, and civil injunctions to bankrupt the small businesses, the state effectively clears the land. This is salami slicing on a municipal scale. They make the block so uncomfortable, so legally treacherous, and so economically depressed that the current residents are forced to leave. As the crime rate artificially spikes due to the removal of management-level gang members, property values plummet. Then comes the pivot. The city announces a revitalization project. The same streets that were once treated as war zones are suddenly rebranded as historic districts. The police presence, once antagonistic and aggressive, becomes protective as the first wave of high-end developers arrives. The state has successfully used the gang as a tool of displacement. By labeling the entire social fabric of the block as criminal, they have justified its destruction. The block isn't saved. It is deleted and replaced with a sterilized version of itself that the original residents can no longer afford to inhabit. The tales from the block end not with a bang, but with a for sale sign and a Starbucks on the corner where the trap house once stood. The unifying theory of this entire investigation is that the system is not broken. It is functioning exactly as intended. The mirror syndicate of the Rampart era wasn't an anomaly. It was the logical conclusion of a war where the participants share the same goals: power, profit, and the control of territory. The state needs the gang to justify its budgets, its technology, and its expansion of power. The gang needs the state's pressure to maintain its internal discipline and its high-risk, high-reward economy. They are two sides of the same coin, flipping endlessly in the air over the American city. The machine cannot be stopped because the machine has no exit strategy. It only has a reset button. We see this reset every decade. A new unit is formed to replace the old, corrupted one. A new law is passed to broaden the definition of conspiracy. A new database is built to track the next generation of threats. And on the block, the young men continue to pick up the rags, unaware that they are merely data points in a federal grant application. The cycle continues because it is a self-sustaining ecosystem of attrition. The state has mastered the art of managing the problem rather than solving it, because a solved problem is a budget cut. As the sun rises over the sprawl of Los Angeles, the strobes of the patrol cars finally dim. The crime scene tape is rolled up, and the street sweepers move in to clear the debris of last night's tactical entry. To the casual observer, it looks like progress. But to the people who remain, those who haven't been swept up in a RICO dragnet or marked by a database, the silence is heavy. They know that the peace is temporary. They know that the state will be back, not to help, but to harvest. The block remains, but it is a hollowed-out version of itself, waiting for the next generation to be fed into the gears of the mirror syndicate. The architecture of the permanent underclass is perhaps most visible in the transition from the physical street to the digital archive. In the 1980s, a police officer's black book was a literal notebook tucked into a breast pocket, filled with scribbled nicknames and suspected alliances. Today, that notebook has been replaced by a sprawling, interconnected web of servers known as gang databases. These are the modern-day ledgers of the state's shadow economy. In cities like Chicago, the strategic subject list once assigned a numerical score to residents based on their likelihood of being involved in a shooting. This wasn't based on criminal records alone, but on network density. How many degrees of separation existed between a teenager and a victim of violence? It is the gamification of the ghetto, where the state uses the same algorithms designed for high-frequency stock trading to predict which 16-year-old will be the next to bleed. The true paradox of this digital policing is that it creates the very behavior it seeks to prevent. Imagine a young man named Elias in the Mission District of San Francisco. Elias is not a member of the Norteños, but his older brother is. Because they share an address, a last name, and a social circle, the police algorithms flag Elias as a peripheral associate. When Elias applies for a job at a local warehouse, the background check, now integrated with private security databases that scrape public intelligence files, returns a red flag. The warehouse manager doesn't see a high school graduate looking for a start. He sees a liability. Rejected from the legal economy, Elias finds that the only people who will give him a job are the very people the state says he shouldn't associate with. The database isn't a mirror of the street. It is a funnel. This funneling effect is reinforced by territorial injunctions, which act as a form of localized martial law. These civil orders essentially turn a public neighborhood into a private prison. Under an injunction, the most mundane human activities, washing a car on the street, carrying a pager or a cell phone, or even wearing a specific shade of clothing, become jailable offenses for anyone named on the document. In the Oak Park neighborhood of Sacramento, these injunctions have been used to freeze the social life of the block for decades. The state's argument is that by restricting non-criminal activities, they can prevent the conditions that lead to crime. But for the resident who isn't involved in the set, the result is a state of constant low-level harassment. Consider the collateral lens of a local pastor, Reverend Miller, who has spent 40 years trying to keep kids off the corners. He watches as the police use an injunction to arrest a group of young men standing outside his church after a funeral. They aren't selling drugs. They are mourning. But because they are on the list, their presence together is a violation of the civil order. The Reverend realizes that the law no longer cares about the act. It only cares about the assembly. The state has successfully criminalized the community's social fabric under the guise of public safety. This is the salami slicing of civil liberties, where the rights of the individual are peeled away one layer at a time until only the status of subject remains. As the state tightens its grip through technology and civil law, the internal dynamics of the gangs themselves begin to mutate. The war of attrition has forced the Bloods and Crips to evolve into leaner, more decentralized, and more paranoid entities. The era of the supergang, massive organizations like the El Ruckans or the Latin Kings with a clear, hierarchical chain of command, is being replaced by the microset. These are small, hyperlocal cells of 10 to 15 individuals who operate with no central leadership and no long-term strategy. They are the insurgents of the alleyway. Because they lack the business logic of the older generation, they are far more prone to senseless violence over perceived slights on social media. This shift from organized to disorganized crime is a direct result of the state's decapitation strategies. When a RICO dragnet removes the board of directors of a set, it doesn't leave a peaceful neighborhood. It leaves a power vacuum. This vacuum is filled by what the street calls crash dummies, young men who value clout over capital. To a crash dummy, a viral video of a shooting is more valuable than a stable drug territory. The state's intervention has effectively lowered the IQ of the street while increasing its lethality. The police departments then use this increased volatility to lobby for more funding, more surveillance technology, and more aggressive strike teams. It is a perfect feedback loop where the state's cure exacerbates the disease, which in turn justifies a higher dosage of the cure. The economic reality of this war is perhaps the most cynical layer of the tales from the block. We are told the war on gangs is about public safety, but the data suggests it is often about land speculation. In the early 2000s, the city of Los Angeles used a massive gang injunction against the Grape Street Crips. At the time, the area was seen as a lost cause. But as the injunction pushed the active members out of the neighborhood and into the surrounding suburbs, the land began to clear. Family-owned businesses that had survived the 1992 riots were shut down through nuisance abatement lawsuits. The city claimed these businesses were magnets for gang activity. But once the storefronts were boarded up, they weren't replaced by community centers. They were sold to developers. This is the gentrification dragnet. The state uses the police as an advance guard to clean the neighborhood of its human liabilities. Once the block is sufficiently depopulated of its original residents, the rezoning begins. The same streets that were once the subject of 6 p.m. news reports about gang warfare are suddenly featured in lifestyle magazines as the next up-and-coming district. The irony is bitter. The state uses the threat of the gang to justify the displacement of the community, only to build luxury housing on the very soil where it once claimed blood was being spilled daily. The block is not a place to be saved. It is a commodity to be flipped. The non-players in this scenario, the working-class families who paid their taxes and kept their heads down, find themselves caught in a pincer movement. On one side is the unpredictable violence of the microsets, and on the other is the predictable bureaucratic violence of the state. They are pushed out by rising rents and zero-tolerance policing. When a mother in Oakland is evicted because her teenage son was caught with a controlled substance 3 blocks away, the state isn't fighting crime. It is practicing population management. The goal is to break the chain of tenancy that allows a community to maintain its identity over generations. Without that identity, there is no resistance to the coming tide of capital. The unifying theory of the Tales from the Block is that we are witnessing a new form of internal colonialism. The state manages the ghetto not as a part of the body politic, but as a resource to be extracted and eventually reclaimed. The gangs are the native insurgency that provides the necessary pretext for the military and legal occupation of the territory. The informant economy, the RICO dragnet, and the digital scarlet letter are all tools of this occupation. They are designed to ensure that the bloc remains in a state of perpetual crisis, preventing the formation of any real political or economic power that could challenge the status quo. As we look at the wreckage of the Rampart Scandal or the fallout of the latest RICO sweep in Atlanta, we must ask, who does this system serve? It doesn't serve the victims of violence, who are often re-traumatized by the legal process. It doesn't serve the youth, who are branded for life before they reach adulthood. It serves the machine, the multi-billion-dollar industry of incarceration, the high-tech firms selling surveillance algorithms, and the developers waiting for the all-clear signal to break ground. The tales from the block are not stories of failure. They are the field notes of a highly successful, highly profitable operation. The Mirror Syndicate is still active, though it has traded the secret tattoos of the Rampart era for the predictive policing dashboards of today. The officers don't need to plant a gun when they can simply plant a data point. The state's monopoly on violence is now a monopoly on information. And as long as the public remains convinced that the block is a place of inherent, inexplicable evil, the machine will continue to turn. The tragedy is not that the war is being lost. The tragedy is that the war is being won, and the prize is the total erasure of the people who once called those streets home. The street doesn't end with the end title card. It ends with a quiet displacement. A U-Haul truck parked in front of a house where 3 generations once lived. A new security zone sign posted on a corner that used to host neighborhood barbecues. A silent, digital file in a server farm in Virginia that marks a 10-year-old boy as high risk. The state has won. The block has been dismantled, not by a better idea, but by a more efficient machine. And as the new residents move in, sipping their lattes and walking their dogs through the historic district, they will never know the names of the men who were traded for their comfort. They will never know the price of the Mirror Syndicate. The phenomenon of the global block represents the final mutation of this system. The tactics honed in the alleyways of South Central and the high-rises of Chicago have become a premium export product. We see the mirror syndicate logic appearing in the pacification units of Brazil's favelas, where the state enters with the same extrajudicial swagger as the Rampart crash unit, only to establish a parallel government that taxes the electricity and the water. We see the digital scarlet letter in the United Kingdom's gang matrix, a database so flawed and racially biased that it was declared a breach of data protection laws, yet it continues to mark black youth as gang-affiliated for their choice of music. The American bloc was the laboratory, the world is now the market. This globalization of the dragnet is fueled by the counterinsurgency model of policing. During the height of the Iraq War, the Pentagon began sharing its human terrain mapping software with domestic police departments. The logic was simple. A neighborhood in North Philadelphia is functionally identical to a village in Fallujah. Both are contested spaces where the population must be mapped, monitored, and manipulated. The state stopped seeing the block as a neighborhood and started seeing it as a theater of operations. This is why your local police department now looks like a mechanized infantry unit. The MRAP vehicles idling in the suburbs are not for protection. They are for psychological dominance. They are a physical manifestation of the badge as a rag, an assertion that the state is the only gang allowed to carry heavy artillery. The informant economy has also evolved, moving from the interrogation room to the pocket of every resident. The state no longer needs to flip an OG when it can flip a smartphone. Through geofence warrants, federal agents can identify every person who was within a 100-yard radius of a crime scene. They don't need a rat to tell them who was at the meeting. They have the GPS metadata. This creates a new, even more corrosive form of paranoia. On the block today, you don't just look at your brother with suspicion. You look at his phone. The digital footprint is the ultimate paperwork. This technological omnipresence has effectively killed the code. There is no silence in a world where your pocket is constantly screaming your location to a server in Langley. The collateral damage of this transition is the total erosion of the public square. In the traditional block, the street was a place of commerce, gossip, and conflict resolution. Today, the street is a red zone. Because of predictive policing, if a group of young men gathers to talk, the algorithm interprets the density of the crowd as a precursor to violence. A drone is dispatched. A cruiser is redirected. The social life of the community is treated as a tactical threat. This forces the neighborhood inside, behind locked doors and barred windows, further isolating the residents and making them more dependent on the state for protection. It is the ultimate irony. The state destroys the community's ability to self-regulate, then points to the resulting chaos as proof that more policing is needed. Consider the microdrama of a single apartment building in the Bronx. This building has been placed under a clean halls program, a variant of the civil injunction. This means the police have the permission of the landlord to enter the private hallways and stop and frisk anyone they find. A father, coming home from a double shift at the hospital, is slammed against the wall by a tactical response unit because he forgot his ID in his apartment. His children watch through the cracked door. In that moment, the state has not prevented a crime. It has radicalized a household. To those children, the system is not a source of justice. It is an unpredictable weather pattern of violence. This is how the mirror syndicate ensures its own longevity, by planting the seeds of resentment in every 6-year-old who watches his father be humiliated for the crime of existing in a clean hall. The unifying theory reaches its peak here. The state is not trying to win the war on gangs. Winning would be a disaster. If the gangs disappeared, the multi-billion-dollar criminal justice industrial complex would starve. If the neighborhoods were truly safe, the justification for the digital scarlet letter would evaporate. The goal is steady-state conflict. The machine needs just enough violence to keep the public afraid, but not enough to threaten the centers of capital. It needs the Bloods and the Crips to remain as the perpetual bogeyman, a justification for the next round of surveillance grants and the next takedown video that will lead the nightly news. As we reach the 7,000th word of this investigation, we must confront the harshest reality of all. The block is an endangered species. Between the RICO dragnets, the informant culture, the digital branding, and the relentless march of gentrification, the traditional American neighborhood is being systematically erased. But the set isn't going away. It's just moving. Driven out of the city centers, the gangs are relocating to the sprawling, neglected suburbs of the inner ring. The same patterns are repeating in places like Ferguson, Missouri, and Antioch, California. The state follows, bringing its drones, its databases, and its developers. The tales from the block are a history of a war that has no front line. It is a war of attrition where the only real victor is the machine. The Rampart paradox was not a glitch. It was a reveal. It showed us that when the state sets out to destroy a monster, it often finds that the monster's skin fits remarkably well. The badge and the rag are now intertwined, two threads in a single tapestry of control. The only question that remains for the resident of the block or the citizen of the state is whether they are a player in this game or merely the board on which it is played. The Mirror Syndicate is watching. The RICO dragnet is sinking. The informant economy is open for business. And on a corner that no longer has a name, a young man looks at a patrol car and sees a mirror. He doesn't see a rescuer. He doesn't even see an enemy. He sees a rival. And as long as that perception holds, the tales from the block will never end. They will only be updated for the next version of the software. The subscription to this violence is mandatory, and the price is the soul of the city. The documentary ends not with a solution, but with a reflection. We have built a system that requires an underclass to function, a villain to justify its heroes, and a block to sacrifice for its growth. To understand the street is to understand the state. They are reflections of one another, separated only by the thickness of a badge. If you want to see the future, don't look at the high-rises or the tech hubs. Look at the places where the light from the strobes doesn't reach. Look at the shadows where the Mirror Syndicate is still doing its work. Because sooner or later, the block comes for everyone. This concludes our investigation into the mechanics of the American shadow state. If you found this analysis vital to your understanding of the modern landscape, consider joining our community of thinkers. Your engagement ensures that these stories, the ones the state would rather keep in the database, are told with the grit and depth they deserve. The block is watching. Are you? The algorithm is the new OG. It doesn't sleep, it doesn't take a percentage, and it never breaks under interrogation. In the quiet corridors of a data center in Northern Virginia, the tales from the block are being rewritten in binary. We have transitioned from the era of the Mirror Syndicate, where officers like Rafael Perez played at being gangsters, to a far more efficient and terrifying era of automated neutralization. The state has realized that it no longer needs to infiltrate the gang when it can simply simulate it. By feeding 40 years of arrest records, social media interactions, and shot detection data into a neural network, the government has created a digital ghost of the neighborhood, a digital twin that allows them to predict dissent before it manifests as a crime. This is the ultimate evolution of the RICO dragnet, the preemptive indictment. Imagine a humid Tuesday evening in Liberty City, Miami. A drone, small enough to be mistaken for a bird, hovers at 400 feet. It isn't looking for a muzzle flash. It is mapping anomalous behavior. It notes 3 young men standing too long near a specific hydrant. It cross-references their faces with the gang database. It checks their social proximity score. If the probability of an event crosses a certain percentage, a patrol car is dispatched to disrupt the environment. The officers don't know why they are there. They are simply following a waypoint on a screen. This is the clinical perfection of the permanent underclass. The state has removed the human element from the hunt, replacing the visceral hatred of the Rampart era with the cold, unblinking logic of the machine. To the youth on the corner, the police are no longer men. They are the physical limbs of an invisible, omniscient God. The unifying theory of this investigation reveals that the block is not a glitch in the American dream, but its laboratory. Every tactic used to manage the surplus population of the ghetto eventually migrates to the mainstream. The digital scarlet letter that marks a teenager in Chicago as a gang member is the precursor to the social credit systems that will eventually monitor all of us. The civil injunctions that restrict movement in the Bronx are the prototypes for the 15-minute cities of the future, where geography is managed by digital gatekeepers. The state doesn't just want to control the gang. It wants to use the gang as a pretext to build the infrastructure of total social management. When the law mimics the street, it isn't just a loss of moral authority. It is the birth of a new kind of state, one where safety is the currency used to buy the total surrender of privacy and autonomy. Consider the collateral lens of a 10-year-old named Leo. Leo doesn't know about RICO statutes or the nuances of nuisance abatement, but he knows that every time he walks to school, he is being watched by cameras that can read the logo on his backpack. He knows that his older brother is a data point that keeps the family's rent high and their police presence constant. To Leo, the American bloc is a theater where the play is always the same. His people are the villains, the men in the cruisers are the directors, and the ending is always a cage or a coffin. This is the harsh reality that the state cannot calculate. The total loss of hope is a more dangerous force than any gang. When a generation grows up believing the system is just a rival set with better branding, the possibility of a shared social contract evaporates. The informant economy has finally reached its saturation point. We are now in the age of universal participation. Through social media, the state has turned the entire neighborhood into a decentralized spy network. Every story posted on Instagram, every live stream from a house party, is a proffer session in disguise. The FBI doesn't need to flip a leader when the leader is broadcasting his location and his inventory to 3 million people in real time. This has created a culture of hyperparanoia that is more effective than any wiretap. The Brotherhood is dead, killed by the clout economy. The gang has become a hierarchy of disposable assets, where everyone is filming everyone else, waiting for the moment they can trade a video for a viral hit or a reduced sentence. The street hasn't ended in a shootout. It has ended in a content feed, where loyalty is the least valuable currency. The final act of the Mirror Syndicate is the physical erasure of the memory of the bloc. As the gentrification dragnets reach their conclusion, the history of these neighborhoods is being rewritten. The stucco apartments where the Bloods and Crips once fought for territory are being torn down to make way for innovation hubs and creative lofts. The state provides tax breaks to the developers, the same way they provided overtime to the crash units. It is all an investment in the cleaning of the land. The tales from the block are being replaced by the marketing of the district. The trauma, the resistance, and the complex sociology of the neighborhood are being sanitized into a gritty aesthetic for people who have never had to worry about a territorial injunction. The people who built the culture of the block are being pushed into the inner ring suburbs, where the cycle of RICO surveil displace will begin all over again. This is the war of attrition in its terminal phase. The state has realized that it cannot eliminate the criminal element because the system requires it. Instead, it has opted for managed obsolescence. It will move the problem from one zip code to another, harvesting the data and the real estate at every stop. The law and order of the American ghetto is a perpetual motion machine, fueled by the bodies of young men and the dreams of families like Maria Elena's or Mrs. Gable's. It is a machine that converts chaos into budget and tragedy into capital. To understand the block is to see the gears of this machine in motion. It is to recognize that the badge and the rag are both just uniforms for a conflict that is designed to have no winner. As we conclude this investigation, the lights are flickering in a housing project in East St. Louis. A teenager is looking at a paperwork leak on his phone, deciding whether his best friend is a brother or a witness. A developer in a glass-walled office in downtown is looking at a map of that same project, calculating the unlocked value of the land if the residents were removed. And a federal agent is sitting in a darkened room, watching a drone feed, waiting for the anomalous behavior that will justify the next $1 million grant. The Mirror Syndicate is not a ghost of the past. It is the architect of the future. The paradox has become the standard operating procedure. The state has become the set, and the block is the only thing left to lose. If you have stayed with us through this deep dive into the architecture of the American shadow state, you now see the world with a clarity that the system tries to obscure. The tales from the block are your tales, because the mechanics of control never stay contained. They expand until the block is everywhere. To resist the machine, you must first see the machine. You must understand that no snitching was never just about protecting a criminal. It was a desperate, flawed attempt to maintain a social bond in the face of a state that wanted to turn every brother into an informant. You must understand that the RICO Act was never just about the mafia. It was about the power to define anyone as a conspiracy. The street is quiet now, but it isn't a peaceful quiet. It is the silence of a monitored room. It is the quiet of a community that has been mapped, tagged, and prepared for liquidation. But in that silence, there is also the memory of what was once a neighborhood. There is the ghost of the brotherhood before it was commodified. There is the potential for a different story, one that doesn't end with a digital scarlet letter or a nuisance abatement. But that story requires us to stop looking at the block as a problem to be policed and start looking at the state as a power to be checked. This investigation is over, but the reality it describes is unfolding right now, just outside your window, in the data on your phone, and in the law and order rhetoric of the next election. The Mirror Syndicate is open for business. The RICO dragnet is being cast. The informant economy is hiring. And the block, the real human breathing block, is fighting for its life. If you want to see where this ends, don't look at the news. Look at the shadows. Look at the places where the state says there is nothing to see. Because that is where the truth is hidden, and that is where the next tales from the block are currently being written in blood and binary.